On my videos on the Second World War, I quite regularly get comments along the lines that the Wehrmacht wasn't ready in 1939 and that Hitler's mistake was that he didn't continue the build-up for a few more years, so that the Wehrmacht and the German industry would be ready for war. Well, let's look at these points. First, the Wehrmacht was not ready in 1939. In summer 1939, the German leadership considered the field army not ready for war, and about 1/3 of the divisions were seriously under-equipped. Now the second part, namely the assumption that Germany could have just finished the build-up of the Wehrmacht to full readiness while the Allies would have done nothing, is quite naive and wrong in many aspects. Depending on the commenter's interest, it is usually focused on either one of the following goals: the full motorization and/or mechanization of the German army, a large Kriegsmarine, ideally according to the Z plan, or the Luftwaffe being equipped with jet fighters. Now the writers of these comments basically make two assumptions. Namely that the Allies did not really prepare for war and would also not continue to do this for several years onward. Yet these assumptions are not backed up at all by any historical evidence. Let's look at the British first. In 1934-35, the General Staff, contemplating the possibility that they might again have to dispatch an expeditionary force to fight alongside France to contain Germany, prepared a program to modernize and expand their small army. Although politicians later scaled back the plans of the General Staff and Chamberlain smashed them in early 1938, only 1 year later, in early 1939, he agreed to an expansion of the territorial army from 13 to 26 divisions. At this point, the Chief of Staff began to prepare plans in case of a war against Germany and Italy. Soon, in summer 1939, Britain reintroduced conscription. Now it is important to note that Britain always placed a low priority on its army, since the main line of defense for centuries was the Royal Navy. Of course, one might argue, looking at the early successes of the German in submarine warfare, that the Royal Navy was ill-prepared considering the small U-boat fleet. Since Germany started the war in 1939 with only 39 operational subs, of which only 25 were ocean-going. Be aware that Germany had a few more subs at this point, but not all of them were operational. Yet, at the same time, the Royal Navy had sensible yet limited preparations for anti-submarine warfare. As such, one might argue if Germany would have just built more subs, they could have beaten the Royal Navy. After the war, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz opined that with 300 U-boats in 1939, he could easily have beaten Britain, perhaps. But if Germany had possessed 300 U-boats in 1939, the British would have been much better prepared to meet them. Additionally, the British also recognized early on the threat from the air, and as such built up the first strategic air defense network in the world. Britain worked harder at strategic air defense than any other country because it thought the task vital, yet difficult. The field was the second largest part of the RAF, including 20% of its squadrons, steadily expanding in aircraft and pilots. Now, while the British were rather calmly sitting on the island sipping tea and delayed their war preparations for a while, the French were a bit earlier anxious about German rearmament. After all, who wants to eat a baguette with sauerkraut? In March 1935, Germany reintroduced conscription, which was in violation of the Versailles Treaty. Additionally, it was considered a major threat by the French military. The French military took the view that France's security and military superiority would only be seriously yet then immediately seriously threatened if Germany introduced general conscription. The French still had conscription, yet reduced it to 10.5 months in 1933. Yet as a reaction to German rearmament, the service time was increased to 24 months in October 1935. Now let's move to the French Navy, which kept a close look on the German Navy. For instance, when designing their ships, they looked at German specifications, like the German Deutsche class. Consequently, the French designed the Dunkirk class along known specifications. Intended as an answer to the German Deutsche class, they were given high speed and comparatively light protection, the latter being only intended to defeat the German 11-inch armor-piercing shell, with which the German Deutschland and later Scharnhorst class were armed. Thus similar to the British, the French were not just sitting around and waiting for Germany to build up their forces while doing nothing. Similarly, although not directly related to Germany, but to the Axis powers, the United States also did their part, quite contrary to what some people might suggest. In late 1930s, worsening relations between Japan and the United States led to a further expansion of the US fleet. These developments lay behind the so-called Second Vincent Plan of 1938, which authorized an increase of 20% in overall tonnage. To be more specific, the US Navy Brooklyn-class cruisers armament was directly influenced by the reports on the Imperial Japanese Navy. Apparently, the main factor which convinced the General Board to specify 15 6-inch guns was the attaché report that the Japanese Mogamis would mount 15 6.1-inch guns on 8,500 tons, March 1933. Now, this arming and counter-arming is not something particularly novel. It is quite common in history, and as most of you might know, it's called an arms race. These happen in various ways all around the world. Arms races before the Cold War were often most visible in the naval sphere. This is due to high cost and construction times. After all, naval strategy is build strategy. Here's an example of an extensive arms race of the early 20th century that involved several countries. Within Europe, the following of the dreadnought's lead gave rise to obvious and immediate rivalries between Austria-Hungary and Italy, between Greece and Turkey, and less obviously between France and Italy in the Mediterranean, and between Germany and Russia in the Baltic. But all of these were overshadowed by the rivalry that developed between Britain and Germany. This was the naval race that added more than its share to the poison that affected European relationships prior to 1914. Now, I know the well-informed listeners in my audience might point out now that I'm missing the point because there was another major problem with the continuous German rearmament. Namely, that it was basically unsustainable for the German economy. During the rearmament process, which I discuss further in this video, some German generals already noted in 1936 that the buildup was too fast. And it could only be considered viable if there was an intention to use the Wehrmacht at a specific point in time. As a result, by 1938, the financial situation of Germany was dire after several years of what the military called a permanent mobilization. By November 1938, given the prospective depletion of foreign exchange reserves, it was already clear that Germany would soon have to abandon its all-out rearmament drive in favor of a renewed concentration of exports. Now let's play the devil's advocate here and say somehow the Germans were able to rearm at full speed for several years, without going bankrupt, and in the meantime the Allies would just sip tea and eat baguette. As such, the Germans would have been able to motorize and mechanize a large part of the field army. For instance, Sturmgeschütze for infantry divisions as originally proposed by Manstein, and no more horse-drawn carriages. Well, the problem is now, where do you get the fuel for your Panzers, half-tracks and Stuks? Because fuel was always a major issue for the Axis. Now historically, a large amount of German divisions was not motorized nor mechanized. Here you can see the numbers for one of the better equipped infantry divisions. Yet just a few years into the war, the fuel situation, as long predicted by the Wehrmacht Military Economic Office, was rapidly approaching a critical point in fall-winter 1941. By early 1942, it would not be the Russian mud, but the exhaustion of the Germans' petrol supplies that would ensure the complete paralysis of the army. Or let's look at some more specific numbers for the naval buildup. If the Z-Plan's expansion of the Kriegsmarine would have been performed, the result of such major numbers would have meant that by 1937-48, around 6 million tons of heating oil was necessary and 2 million tons of diesel fuel. Yet even very optimistic numbers on oil production for those years were estimated at 2 million tons of heating oil and about 1.34 million tons of diesel fuel. To conclude, if we look at the years before the outbreak of the Second World War, there's no evidence that the Allies were just sitting around and doing nothing. Quite on the contrary, they reacted in various ways to the rearmament of Germany. Thus, any major increase of German armed forces would have been matched sooner or later. Additionally, this wasn't something particularly new. Arms races are rather common in history. Considering this, it is quite naive to assume that the Germans could just have built up a completely mechanized field army, a Luftwaffe with jet fighters and bombers, and on top of that a mighty Kriegsmarine with enough U-boats and surface ships to challenge the Royal Navy. And even if they did, they wouldn't have enough fuel to make them operational for a sufficient amount of time. Well, I hope you learned something new. If you like this content, consider supporting me on Patreon. Remember, every Reichsmark helps improving the videos. Special thanks to Justin for support on this video. As always, sources and description. Thank you for watching and see you next time.